The first snow of October fell on Cedar Ridge like a whispered warning that nobody wanted to hear. Nestled deep in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state, the small community of 200 souls had weathered countless winters, but the old-timers recognized something different in the air that year. The aspens turned gold 2 weeks early. The elk descended from the high country in September, and Walter Thornton, 73 years old with hands scarred by 5 decades of carpentry, stood in his front yard staring at his modest log cabin with an expression that made his neighbors pause and wonder. The cabin sat on 3 acres of pine and fir at the edge of Cedar Ridge, accessible only by a winding gravel road that became treacherous when the snows came. Walter had built the place with his own hands 40 years earlier, when his wife Margaret was still alive and their daughter Sarah was just learning to walk. The logs were hand-hewn Douglas fir. The foundation was river rock he'd hauled himself, and every joint was fitted with the precision of a man who understood that in these mountains, poor craftsmanship could mean death when winter truly arrived. But what caught everyone's attention that autumn wasn't the cabin itself. It was what Walter was building around it. For 3 weeks in September, the sound of hammer and saw echoed through the valley as Walter constructed what appeared to be an enormous covered porch that encircled his entire home. Except it wasn't a porch. The structure extended 12 feet out from the cabin walls on all 4 sides, supported by sturdy posts of peeled lodgepole pine. The roof was corrugated metal, angled sharply to shed snow, and the whole thing looked like someone had built a massive hat for a house. Did you enjoy this opening? If you're finding this story compelling, take a moment to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your engagement helps us create more content like this, and we read every single comment. What would you do if you knew the worst winter in decades was coming? We'd love to hear from you. The following story is presented as a narrative reconstruction. Dennis Kruger was the first to laugh. He owned the hardware store in town and considered himself something of an expert on mountain construction, despite never having built anything more complex than a storage shed. He stopped by one afternoon in early October, ostensibly to drop off some screws Walter had ordered, but really, to get a closer look at the bizarre project. "Walter, what in God's name are you building here?" Dennis asked, stepping out of his pickup truck and shaking his head at the structure taking shape. "Looks like you're trying to put your house under a carport." Walter paused in his work, a 20-foot board balanced on his shoulder. At 73, he still moved with the deliberate strength of a man who'd never stopped using his body. His face was weathered like old leather, creased with lines that mapped out years of squinting into mountain sunlight and winter glare. His hair had gone completely white, but his blue eyes remained sharp and clear. "It's a woodshed," Walter said simply. Dennis walked around the perimeter, noting the open sides and the careful way Walter had graded the ground beneath the roofline. "A woodshed? Walter, this thing goes all the way around your house. Must be, 200 feet of roofline?" 216, Walter corrected. 12 feet out on all sides from a 36 by 42 cabin. "That's insane," Dennis laughed. "You planning to store wood for the next ice age?" Walter set down the board and pulled out his handkerchief, wiping sawdust from his face. "Just this winter." Something in his tone made Dennis pause. "What do you mean, just this winter?" Walter looked up at the sky, where high cirrus clouds streaked across the deep blue like claw marks. "You see those clouds? Mare's tails. Old-timers call them. See how they're moving southwest to northeast? That means the jet stream's already dipping lower than normal. And did you notice the squirrels?" Dennis frowned. "What about them?" "They've been gathering since August. Non-stop. Their nests are twice as big as usual, and they're building them lower in the trees. The ravens have been staging up too, groups of 40 or 50. Haven't seen that since the winter of '89. Dennis remembered that winter. The town had been snowed in for 6 weeks straight. 3 people had died, including old Tom Hendricks, who'd run out of firewood and tried to make it to town during a whiteout. "You really think it's going to be that bad?" Dennis asked, his smile fading. Walter turned back to his work. "I think when the signs are this clear, a smart man prepares. A foolish one laughs." But Dennis wasn't the only one laughing. By the time October rolled into November and Walter began stacking firewood under his enormous roof structure, The whole town was talking about Thornton's folly. At the post office, the diner, the gas station, people made jokes about the crazy old man who'd built a barn around his house. Some said grief had finally broken him, that he'd never been the same since Margaret died 3 years ago. Others suggested he was going senile, spending his retirement money on a ludicrous project that made his property look like a lumber yard. Sarah called from Seattle, worried. "Dad, Mrs. Patterson from the post office called me. She says you've built some kind of structure around the house. Are you okay?" Walter was outside as he took the call, methodically splitting rounds of alder and stacking them in precise rows under the north side of the roof. "I'm fine, honey. Just getting ready for winter." "She says it looks really strange and expensive." "Dad, are you sure you can afford this? I used wood from the 40 acres up on the ridge. Lumber's free when you cut it yourself. Metal roofing was the only real expense, and I got that on sale back in July." "But why do you need so much firewood storage?" Walter sunk his splitting maul into the chopping block and rested his hands on the handle. "Because this winter's going to be different, Sarah. I can feel it in my bones. Literally. The arthritis in my hands has been screaming since September." Sarah sighed the way children do when their parents say something that sounds crazy, but might also be true. "Just promise me you'll call if you need anything. And Dad, maybe don't spend any more money on that shed thing, okay?" But Walter kept building, kept stacking. Every morning before dawn, he'd fire up his chainsaw and head into the woods. By noon, he'd have a truck bed full of rounds, alder and maple and Douglas fir, which he'd split and stack in the afternoon. The work was hard, harder than it should have been for a man his age, but Walter had always believed that useful work kept a man alive. The structure itself was magnificent in its simplicity. The metal roof extended from just below the cabin's eaves, sloping down and away at a precise angle, calculated to shed even the heaviest snow. The supporting posts were set deep, anchored in concrete that Walter had mixed and poured himself. The open sides allowed air to flow freely, which was crucial for seasoning wood. But the roof kept rain and snow completely off the stacks. By the end of November, Walter had filled 3 sides of the structure with split firewood, stacked in neat rows that reached from ground to roof. Cord after cord of perfectly split wood, each piece arranged so air could circulate, each stack stable and straight. He'd even built a small workbench area on the south side, where he could split kindling in the shelter of the roof. Margaret would have loved it, he thought sometimes. She'd always complained about having to brush snow off the woodpile, about logs being too wet to burn properly. This would have made her happy. The first serious snow came on December 3rd. It started in the afternoon, fat flakes falling straight down in the windless air, and by evening the world had transformed into something from a Christmas card. 6 inches fell overnight, then another 4 the next day. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees and stayed there. That's when the laughing stopped. Martin Bexley lived 3 houses down from Walter, in a newer construction that his wife had insisted on when they retired to Cedar Ridge 5 years earlier. Martin heated with wood, like most people in the valley, but he'd always kept his supply stacked against the side of his garage, covered with a tarp that the wind inevitably pulled loose. When he went out that first cold morning to grab firewood for the day, he found his entire stack coated in a shell of ice from the snow that had melted against the still warm wood, then refrozen. It took him 20 minutes to chip apart enough logs to get his morning fire started, and even then the wood sizzled and steamed, burning inefficiently and filling his house with smoke. He looked up the road to where Walter's place sat, and saw the old man walking calmly under his covered structure, selecting dry logs as easily as if it were summer. No ice, no snow, just perfectly seasoned wood protected from the elements. "Son of a bitch," Martin muttered. The snow kept coming. By December 10th, they had 18 inches on the ground. By the 15th, 32. The temperatures plunged to single digits at night, rising only to the low 20s during the day. The county plow came through every few days, but the road to Cedar Ridge was low priority, and sometimes they had to wait. All over town, people struggled with their firewood. Tarps blew off in the wind. Snow buried stacks. Ice formed on exposed logs. People spent hours each day clearing snow, chipping ice, trying to find dry wood to burn. Fires smoldered instead of roared. Houses stayed cold. Tempers grew short. But Walter Thornton, the crazy old man who'd built Thornton's Folly, walked into his covered woodshed any time of day or night and selected perfectly dry wood. His fires burned hot and clean. His house stayed warm. And he never once said, "I told you so," though he would have been justified. Dennis Kruger stopped by on December 20th, driving carefully through 8 inches of fresh snow. He found Walter sitting on his covered porch, the one integrated into the south side of the woodshed structure, drinking coffee and watching the snow fall. "Mind if I sit?" Dennis asked. Walter gestured to the chair beside him. Both men sat in silence for a while, watching the world turn white. Finally, Dennis spoke. "I'm sorry I laughed." Walter sipped his coffee. "Most people did." "How did you know? About the winter, I mean." Walter was quiet for a long moment. "You live in a place long enough, you learn to read it. The animals know before we do. The plants know. Even the rocks know if you pay attention to how they feel. My grandfather taught me that. He was a trapper up in Alaska, spent 30 years in the Brooks Range. He said nature always warns you, but most people are too busy talking to listen." Dennis nodded slowly. "Think it's going to get worse." Walter looked at the sky. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind was beginning to pick up. "Yeah," he said softly. "Yeah, I think it's just getting started." The old man was right. As December gave way to January, Cedar Ridge found itself in the grip of a winter that would be talked about for generations. The blizzard hit on January 7th with a fury that seemed almost personal. The National Weather Service had issued warnings, but even the meteorologists seemed shocked by the intensity of what developed. A massive low-pressure system stalled over the Cascades, pulling Arctic air down from Canada and moisture up from the Pacific, creating a snow machine that would run continuously for 11 days. The first 72 hours were the worst. Wind howled through Cedar Ridge at sustained speeds of 40 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 70. The snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to 0. People couldn't see their own mailboxes from their front windows. The power lines, already heavy with ice and snow, began to snap. First one section of town went dark, then another, then another. By the second day, all of Cedar Ridge was without electricity. Walter had been through blackouts before. He'd prepared for this one. His wood stove could heat the entire cabin if he kept it fed properly. And with hundreds of cords of bone-dry wood surrounding his house, fuel was the least of his worries. He had oil lamps, batteries, a hand-crank radio, and enough canned food to last months. Margaret had always insisted on preparedness, and even 3 years after her death, he maintained her standards. But his neighbors weren't so fortunate. On the third day of the blizzard, during a brief lull in the wind, Walter heard someone pounding on his door. He opened it to find Martin Bexley standing in waist-deep snow, his face red with cold and exertion. The man had walked 3 houses down in conditions that were borderline suicidal. "Walter," Martin gasped, "I need help. We're almost out of dry wood. Everything I have left is frozen solid. My wife, she has asthma, and the house is getting too cold. She's already having trouble breathing." Walter didn't hesitate. "Come inside and warm up. I'll get you loaded up." Over the next hour, Walter helped Martin load a toboggan with dry firewood, pulling from the massive stores under his protective roof. Each log was perfect, dry enough to catch quickly and burn hot. He gave Martin enough to last a week, maybe more if they were careful. "I can't pay you for this," Martin said, shame coloring his voice. "Not right now, anyway. The store is closed and—" Walter waved him off. "You can settle up in the spring. Right now, you need to get this wood home and get your wife warm. And Martin, come back if you need more. Don't wait until you're desperate." Word spread quickly in the way it does in small communities, especially during crisis. By the end of the week, Walter had provided firewood to 7 different families. He never asked for payment. He just loaded up their sleds or toboggans, made sure they had enough to last, and sent them back into the storm. The Johnsons, who'd moved to Cedar Ridge just 2 years earlier from California and had no idea how to prepare for a real winter. The Mercados, an elderly couple in their 80s whose son usually cut their wood, but who was snowed in 40 miles away. The Callahans, a young family with 3 small children who'd lost their main wood supply when their poorly anchored tarp had blown away in the first storm, scattering their wood across 2 acres of forest, now buried under 4 feet of snow. Each time Walter walked out into his covered woodshed, selected the best logs and sent his neighbors home with full loads and strict instructions to come back when they needed more. His daughter called on the 8th day of the blizzard, using a scratchy satellite phone connection. "Dad, I've been watching the news. They're saying Cedar Ridge is completely cut off. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, honey. House is warm. Food is good. They're talking about sending in the National Guard with helicopters to evacuate people." Walter looked out his window at the whiteout conditions. "Nobody's flying in this. We're on our own for now." "Dad, I'm worried. Please tell me you have enough firewood." Walter smiled. "I've got enough to share, Sarah. That's what I've been doing." There was a long pause. "You're giving away your firewood? During a blizzard?" "People need it. What good is being prepared if you watch your neighbors freeze?" He could hear his daughter's voice crack slightly. "You sound just like Mom." "I take that as the highest compliment." By the 10th day, the community had organized itself around Walter's woodshed the way medieval villages once organized around wells or granaries. A rough trail had been packed down through the snow by the traffic of people coming and going. Walter had established a simple system. He kept a notebook by his door where people signed for how much wood they took, not because he intended to collect payment, but because he wanted to track who might be running low and need a check-in. Dennis Kruger came by with his son on day 11, pulling 2 toboggans. They weren't there for wood. They brought food: a box of canned goods, some frozen meat from Dennis's garage freezer, a basket of his wife's homemade bread that had been baked in a cast-iron Dutch oven over an open fire. "You can't keep giving without receiving," Dennis said. "The whole town has been talking. You've kept 15 families warm, Walter. People want to contribute." "I don't need payment." "It's not payment. It's community. You give wood, we give what we can. That's how it works." Over the following days, others came with offerings. The Mercados brought jarred vegetables from their summer garden. The Johnsons, who'd made a fortune in tech before retiring, brought a generator and enough gasoline to run it for a week, insisting Walter take it. The Callahans' oldest daughter, who was 12 and had been learning violin, came one evening and played for Walter in his warm cabin. A concert of Bach and Irish folk tunes that brought tears to the old man's eyes because Margaret had loved music. The blizzard finally broke on January 18th. The snow stopped, the wind died, and an eerie silence settled over the valley. In total, 62 inches had fallen in 11 days. Drifts against the north sides of buildings reached 15 feet. The county road was invisible under a blanket of white. But the sky was finally clear, achingly blue, and the sun reflected off the snow with such intensity that people had to wear sunglasses just to go outside. The temperature dropped even further. Without cloud cover to trap heat, the thermometer plunged to 7 below zero, then 12 below, then 18 below. Walter had never seen it that cold in Cedar Ridge, not in 40 years. Pipes froze in houses all over town. More power lines snapped under the weight of ice. The propane delivery truck couldn't make it up the mountain, leaving families who heated with gas in desperate straits. But inside Walter's cabin, surrounded on all sides by thousands of split logs stacked under protection, the wood stove glowed red hot, and the temperature stayed at a comfortable 68 degrees. He burned through perhaps a dozen logs a day, a tiny fraction of what he'd stored. Sarah managed to get through on a landline from town. The main highway had finally been plowed, but the road to Cedar Ridge was still impassable. "Dad, they're saying it might be another week before they can dig you all out." "We'll manage." "How's your wood holding up?" Walter looked through his window at the 3 sides of stacked firewood, still mostly full. "I've got enough for the rest of the winter, maybe 2 winters." "Jesus, Dad, everyone said you were crazy." Everyone was wrong. But it wasn't just about being right or proving people wrong. Walter understood something that his neighbors were only beginning to learn. In a place like Cedar Ridge, in conditions like these, isolation could kill you as surely as cold. The woodshed had become more than just storage for fuel. It had become the town's hearth, the gathering place, the insurance policy against disaster. People started stopping by not just for wood, but to check on each other. The covered area on the south side of Walter's structure became an informal meeting point. On clear days, neighbors would gather there, out of the wind, to share information and supplies and news. Who needed help digging out? Whose roof was at risk of collapse under the snow load? Which elderly residents hadn't been seen in a few days and needed checking on? The second major storm hit on January 24th, not as intense as the first, but another 30 inches over 4 days. The county gave up on plowing the road to Cedar Ridge. They were overwhelmed with emergencies across the entire region. The small community was truly on its own. Walter's system kept working. He continued to provide wood to anyone who needed it, and the community continued to pool resources. The Bexleys, who owned a small greenhouse, had been growing lettuce and spinach under LED lights powered by a solar panel system. They shared the fresh greens, a luxury that brought tears to people's eyes after weeks of canned food. The Henderson brothers, who hunted elk in the fall, shared their meat. The Chens, who ran a small bakery in town during normal times, baked bread using Walter's wood stove and distributed it to every household. It was during this second storm that Frank Morrison collapsed. He was 68, a retired logger who lived alone in a cabin on the far edge of the community. He'd been too proud to ask Walter for wood, instead trying to make do with what he had, but his supply had run out, and he'd started burning furniture, then green wood he'd desperately cut from nearby trees. The smoke had been all wrong, and the fire had given off carbon monoxide. The Callahan boy found him during a wellness check organized by the community. Frank was unconscious on his floor, his house filled with deadly gas, his fire reduced to smoking embers. They brought him to Walter's cabin because it was the warmest place in town, and because Walter had basic medical training from his years working in remote logging camps. For 3 days, Frank lay on Walter's couch, drifting in and out of consciousness, while Walter kept the fire burning and the house warm and monitored his breathing. On the 3rd day, Frank opened his eyes and found Walter sitting in a chair nearby, reading an old paperback Western by lamplight. "Why?" Frank croaked. "I never came for wood. I said you were a fool." Walter set down his book. "You needed help, that's all that matters." "I don't deserve this." "Deserving's got nothing to do with it. You're my neighbor. That means something up here." Frank started to cry, big silent tears running down his weathered face. Walter pretended not to notice, just went back to his book and let the man process his emotions in privacy. When the county finally broke through on February 2nd, sending a massive plow followed by a convoy of supply trucks and National Guard vehicles, they found Cedar Ridge not only surviving, but functioning. No deaths, no critical injuries, houses warm, people fed, spirits remarkably high. The National Guard captain, a young man from Seattle who'd never seen anything like the conditions in the mountains, stood in front of Walter's cabin and just stared at the woodshed structure surrounding it. "Sir," he said to Walter, "I've been doing disaster relief for 6 years. I've never seen anything like this. The county told us to expect casualties. Instead, we found a functioning community." Walter shrugged. "People help each other. That's what neighbors do." The captain walked around the perimeter, noting the still full sections of wood, the covered work area, the careful construction. "This structure saved lives." "Common sense saved lives," Walter corrected. This just made it easier. But even Walter had to admit, as he watched the relief convoy unload supplies and the news crews that had followed them set up cameras, that something remarkable had happened. The shed that everyone had mocked had become the town's salvation. More than that, it had become a symbol of what preparation and generosity could accomplish. Spring came late to Cedar Ridge that year. The snow didn't fully melt until mid-April, leaving behind a landscape transformed by the brutal winter. Trees had fallen under the weight of ice. Roofs had collapsed. The community center's metal roof had buckled, and 2 barns on the outskirts of town were total losses. But not a single person had been lost, and as the snow receded, revealing brown grass and mud and the first tentative shoots of green, the town began to take stock of what had happened. Walter's woodshed stood exactly as he'd built it, the metal roof gleaming in the spring sun, the support posts solid and straight. The wood that remained, perhaps a third of what he'd stored, was still perfectly dry and stacked. He'd burned relatively little himself. Most of what he'd gone through had been given away. On the first truly warm day of spring, with temperatures finally climbing into the 50s, the town held a meeting in Walter's yard. It wasn't official or planned. People just started showing up, bringing folding chairs and blankets to sit on, gathering in the space under the woodshed's southern overhang, where they'd congregated so many times during the dark winter months. Dennis Kruger stood up to speak, though nobody had appointed him. "We all know why we're here," he began. "We need to talk about what happened this winter, and we need to thank the man who made it possible for all of us to survive." Walter, sitting on his porch steps, shifted uncomfortably. "I just built a shed." "You built a lot more than that," Martin Bexley said, standing. "You built insurance. You built community. Hell, Walter, you built hope. When my wife couldn't breathe because our house was freezing, you saved her life. That wasn't just a shed." Others stood one by one, sharing their stories. The Johnsons talked about how their children would have been evacuated to shelters if not for the firewood Walter provided. The Mercados explained that at their age, exposure to that kind of cold could have been fatal. Frank Morrison, still recovering from his carbon monoxide exposure, simply said, "He took me into his home when I'd called him a fool. That's character you can't build with lumber." Sarah had driven up from Seattle for the gathering, and she stood with tears in her eyes. "My father learned this from my mother," she said. "Margaret always said that preparedness without generosity is just hoarding, but preparedness with generosity is civilization. Dad lived that principle, he still does." The town council president, a woman named Rebecca Torres, cleared her throat. "We've been discussing this as a council, and we want to propose something. Walter, we'd like to use town funds to build similar structures at strategic locations around Cedar Ridge. Not as large as yours, but covered woodsheds where we can maintain community emergency supplies. We'd like you to consult on the design." Walter rubbed his weathered hands together, considering. "I'll do it for free on one condition. Every able-bodied person helps with the construction, not just for the labor, but so everyone learns how it's done. Next time, people can protect their own supplies." The motion passed unanimously. Over the summer, 4 community woodsheds went up around Cedar Ridge. Walter supervised the construction, teaching the younger residents how to set posts properly, how to calculate roof angles for snow load, how to arrange wood for proper air circulation. The Callahan kids learned to use power tools. The Johnson father, a software engineer who'd never built anything, discovered he had a talent for carpentry. Frank Morrison, determined to repay his debt, worked harder than men half his age. But something else happened that summer, something Walter hadn't anticipated. Visitors started coming to Cedar Ridge. First, it was a journalist from a Seattle newspaper, writing a human interest story about the town that survived the winter of the century. Then came a documentary crew. Then urban survivalists and homesteaders and people who'd lived through their own disasters and wanted to learn. They all wanted to see Thornton's woodshed. Walter gave tours reluctantly at first, but Sarah convinced him it was important. "Dad, you have knowledge people need. The world is getting more unpredictable. If you can teach people how to prepare, how to build resilience into their lives, that's valuable." So Walter started teaching. He showed people how to read weather signs, how animals telegraph coming storms, how to calculate a winter's worth of firewood based on house size and climate zone. He explained thermal dynamics and moisture content and the difference between hardwoods and softwoods. He demonstrated his splitting technique, the product of 50 years of practice, and explained why proper stacking mattered as much as having wood in the first place. By fall, Walter's informal classes had become regular events. People came from Portland, from Spokane, from Vancouver. Some were preppers, some were just practical people who'd seen how climate patterns were changing. Walter treated them all the same, sharing what he knew without judgment. The first snow fell on October 15th, earlier than usual. Walter watched it from his porch, surrounded by his refilled woodshed, every section stacked full again with next winter's supply. But this year he wasn't alone in his preparation. All around Cedar Ridge, houses had their own covered wood storage, not as elaborate as Walter's, but functional, dry, ready. Dennis stopped by that evening, as had become his habit. The two men sat in silence for a while, watching the snow fall in the gathering darkness. "Think this winter will be as bad?" Dennis finally asked. Walter smiled slightly. "Doesn't matter. We're ready either way." And that was the truth of it. The shed that people had mocked, the project that had seemed like folly, had taught Cedar Ridge something more valuable than any amount of dry firewood. It had taught them that preparation wasn't paranoia, that community was stronger than individualism, and that sometimes the crazy old man building something strange in his yard was the sanest person in town. As winter settled over the Cascades once more, Walter Thornton sat warm and content in his cabin, knowing that this time, when the storms came, his neighbors would be warm too. The woodshed had done its job. But more importantly, it had shown people what was possible when you paid attention to the signs, prepared for the worst, and shared what you had when others needed it. Margaret would have been proud. The snow continued to fall, soft and steady, blanketing Cedar Ridge in white. But this year nobody was laughing. This year everyone was ready, and in a small mountain community where winter could still kill the unprepared, that readiness made all the difference between survival and tragedy, between isolation and community, between fear and peace. Walter finished his coffee, stood up, and walked out into his woodshed. He selected 3 perfect logs, carried them inside, and fed his fire. The wood caught immediately, burning clean and hot, filling his home with warmth as the temperature outside dropped and the wind began to howl through the pines. He was ready for whatever came next, and so was his town.